Broadway Financier by Damon Runyon. Of all the scores made by dolls on Broadway the past 25 years, there is no doubt but what the very largest score is made by a doll who is called Silk, when she knocks off a banker by the name of Israel Ibb for the size of Silk's score is 3,100,000 bobs and a few odd cents. It is admitted by one and all who know about these matters that the record up to this time is held by a doll by the name of Ermatique, who knocks off a Russian duke back in 1911, when Russian dukes are considered very useful by dolls, although of course in these days Russian dukes are about as useful as dandruff. Anyway, Ermatique's score off this Russian duke is up around 1,000,000, and she moves to London with her duke and chucks quite a swell around there for a time. But finally, Ermatique goes blind, which is a tough break for her as she can no longer see how jealous she is making other dolls with her diamonds and sables and one thing and another, so what good are they to her after all? I know Ermatique when she is a show doll at the Old Winter Garden, and I also know the doll by the name of Maisie Mitz, who is in a Floridora revival, and who makes a score of maybe 300 G's off a guy who has a string of 10-cent stores, and 300 G's is by no means hay. But Maisie Mitz finally hauls off and runs away with a saxophone player she is in love with, and so winds up back at the 15 ball. Furthermore, I know Clara Simmons, the model from Rixon's, who gets a 5-story townhouse and a country place on Long Island off a guy in Wall Street for birthday presents, and while I never meet this guy personally, I always figure he must be very dumb because anybody who knows Clara Simmons knows she will just as well be satisfied with a bottle of perfume for a birthday present. For all I know, Clara Simmons may still own the townhouse and the country place, but she must be shoving on toward 40 now, so naturally nobody on Broadway cares of what becomes of her. I know 100 other dolls who run at different scores, and some of them are very fair scores indeed, but none of these scores are anything much alongside Silk's score off Israel Ibb. And this score is all the more surprising because Silk starts out being greatly prejudiced against bankers. I am no boosters for bankers myself, as I consider them very stony-hearted guys, but I am not prejudiced against them. In fact, I consider bankers very necessary, because if we do not have bankers, many citizens will not be able to think of anybody to give a check on. It is quite a while before she meets Israel Ibb that Silk explains to me why she is prejudiced against bankers. It is when she is nothing but a chorus doll in Johnny Oakley's joint on 53rd Street and comes into Mindy's after she gets through work, which is generally along about 4 o'clock in the morning. At such an hour, many citizens are sitting around Mindy's resting from the crap games and one thing and another, and dolls from the different joints around and about, including chorus dolls and hostesses, drop in for something to eat before going home, and generally these dolls are still in their makeup and very tired. Naturally, they come to know the citizens who are sitting around and say hello and maybe accept the hospitality of these citizens, such as Java and Danish pastry, or maybe a few scrambled eggs, and it is all very pleasant and harmless, because a citizen who is all tuckered out from shooting craps is not going to get any high blood pressure over a tired chorus doll or hostess, and especially a hostess. Well, one morning, Silk is sitting at my table, guzzling a cup of Java and a piece of apple pie, when in comes the Greek, looking very weary. The Greek being a high shot who is well known far and wide. He drops into a chair alongside me and orders a Bismarck herring with sliced onions to come along, which is a dish that is considered most invigorating. And then the Greek mentions that he is playing the bank for 24 hours hand running, so right away Silk speaks up as follows. "I hate banks," she says. "Furthermore," she says, "I hate bankers. If it is not for a banker, maybe I will not be slaving in Johnny Oakley's dirty little drum for 30 bobs per week. Maybe my mama will still be alive, and I will be living at home with her instead of in a flea bag in 47th Street. My mama once saves up 300 bobs from scrubbing floors in an office building to send me to school," Silk says. "And a banker in one of the buildings where she does this scrubbing tells her to put her dough in his bank, and what happens but the bank busts, and it is such a terrible blow to my mama that she ups and dies. I am very small at the time," Silk says, "but I can remember standing in front of the busted bank with my mama and my mama crying her eyes out." Well, personally, I consider Silk's crack about Johnny Oakley's joint uncalled for, as it is by no means little, but I explained to her that what the Greek is talking about is a faro bank and not a bank you put money in, as such a bank is called a jug and not a bank at all. While a faro bank is a gambling game, and the reason I explain this to Silk is because everybody always explains things to her. The idea is everybody wishes Silk to be well smartened up, especially everybody who hangs around Mindy's, because she is an orphan and never has a chance to go to school, and we do not wish her to grow up dumb like the average doll, as one and all are very fond of Silk from the first minute she bobs up around Mindy's. Now, at this time, Silk is maybe 17 years old and weighs maybe 90 pounds sopping wet, and she is straight up and down like a boy. She has soft brown hair and brown eyes that seem too big for her face, and she looks right at you when she talks to you, and she talks to you like one guy to another guy. In fact, I always claim there is more guy in Silk than there is doll, as she finally gets so she thinks like a guy, which is maybe she associates more with guys than she does with other dolls, and she gets a guy's slant on things in general. She loves to sit around Mindy's in the early morning gabbing with different citizens, although she does more listening than gabbing herself, and she loves to listen to gab about horse racing and baseball and fights and crap shooting, and to guys cutting up old touches and whatever else is worth gabbing about, and she seldom sticks in her oar, except maybe to ask a question. Naturally, a doll who is willing to listen instead of wishing to gab herself is bound to be popular, because if there is anything most citizens hate and despise, it is a gabby doll. So then, many citizens take a real interest in Silk's education, including Regret, the horse player, who explains to her how to build up a sucker to betting on a hot horse, although personally I do not consider such knowledge of any more value to a young doll just starting out in the world than the lesson Big Nig, the crap shooter, gives her one night on how to switch in the pair of tops on a craps game. Then there is Doc Darrow, who is considered one of the highest class operators that ever rides the tubs in his day, being a great hand for traveling back and forth across the ocean and outplaying other passengers at bridge and poker and one thing and another, but who finally gets rheumatism in his hands so bad that he can no longer shuffle the cards. And of course, if Doc Darrow cannot shuffle the cards, there is no sense whatever in him trying to play games of skill anymore. Doc Darrow is always telling Silk what rascals guys are and explaining to her the different kinds of businesses they will try to give her, this being the same kind of business the Doc gives dolls himself in his time. The Doc has an idea that a young doll who is battling Broadway needs plenty of education along such lines, but Silk tells me privately that she is Jerry to the stuff Doc is telling her when she is 5 years old. The guy I figured does Silk the most good is an old pappy guy by the name of Professor D, who is always reading books when he is not busy doping the horses. In fact, Professor D is considered somewhat daffy on the subject of reading books, but it seems he gets the habit from being a teacher in a college out in Ohio before he becomes a horse player. Anyway, Professor D takes to giving Silk books to read, and what is more, she reads them and talks them over afterward with the professor, who is greatly pleased by this. "She is a bright little doll," Professor D says to me one day. "Furthermore," the professor says, "she has a soul." "Well," I say, "Big Nig claims she can palm a pair of dice as good as anybody he ever sees." But the professor only says hi-ho and goes along, and I can see he does not consider me a character worth having much truck with, even though I am as much interested in Silk's education as anybody else. Well, what happens one night is but the regular singer in Johnny Oakley's joint, a doll by the name of Myrtle Marigold, hauls off and catches the measles from her 12-year-old son. And as Johnny has enough trouble getting customers into his joint without giving them the measles after getting them there, he gives Myrtle Marigold plenty of wind at once. But there he is without anybody to sing Stacker Lee to his customers, Stacker Lee being a ditty with which Myrtle Marigold panics the customers, so Johnny looks his chorus over and finally asks Silk if she can sing. And Silk says she can sing all right, but that she will not sing Stacker Lee because she considers it a low-down lullaby at best. She says she will sing something classical, and being desperate for singing, Johnny Oakley says go ahead. So what does Silk do but sing a very old song called Annie Laurie, which she learns from her mama, and she sings this song so loud that sobs are heard all over the joint. Of course, if anybody investigates, they will learn that the sobbing is being done by Professor D and Big Nig and the Greek, who happen to be in the joint at the time, and what they are sobbing about is the idea of Silk singing at all. But Johnny Oakley considers her a big hit and keeps her singing Annie Laurie right along. And one night, Harry Fitz, the booking agent, drops in and hears her singing and tells Ziegfeld he's discovered a doll with a brand new style. Naturally, Ziggy signs her up at once for the Follies because he has great faith in Harry Fitz's judgment, but after Ziggy hears Silk sing, he asks her if she can do anything else, and is greatly relieved when he learns she can dance. So Silk becomes a Ziegfeld dancer, and she is quite a sensation with the dramatic critics on the night she opens because she dances with all her clothes on, which is considered a very great novelty indeed. The citizens around Mindy's chip in and send Silk a taxicab full of orchids and a floral pillow, and Professor D contributes a book called The Outline of History, and Silk is the happiest doll in town. A year goes by, and what a year the Follies does for Silk is most astonishing. Personally, I never see a lot of change in her looks except her figure fills out so it has bumps here and there where a doll is entitled to have bumps, and her face grows to fit her eyes more, but everybody else claims she becomes beautiful, and her picture is always in the papers, and dozens of guys are always hanging around after her and sending her flowers and one thing and another. One guy in particular starts sending her jewelry, which Silk always brings around to Mindy's for Jewelry Joe to look at. This Jewelry Joe being a guy who peddles jewelry along Broadway for years and can tell you in a second what a piece of jewelry is worth. Jewelry Joe finds that the jewelry Silk brings around is nothing much but slum, and naturally he advises her to have no further truck with any party who cannot send in anything better than this. But But one morning, she shows up in Mindy's with an emerald ring the size of a cake of soap. And the minute Jewelry Joe sees the emerald, he tells Silk that whoever donates this is worthy of very careful consideration. Now, it seems that the party who sends the emerald is nobody but Israel Ibb, the banker who owns the jug down on the Lower East Side that is called the Bank of the Bridges, and the way Silk comes to connect with him is most unusual. It is through a young guy by the name of Simeon Slotsky, who is a teller in Israel Ibb's jug, and who sees Silk dancing one night in the Follies and goes right off his kazip about her. It is this Simeon Slotsky who is sending the jewelry that Silk first brings around, and the way he is buying this jewelry is by copying a little dough out of the jug now and then, which does not belong to him. Naturally, this is a most dishonest action, and by they catch up with Simeon Slotsky in the jug, and Israel Ibb is going to place him in the pokey. Well, Simeon Slotsky does not wish to be placed in the pokey, and not knowing what else to do, what does he do but go to Silk and tell her his story, explaining that if he commits this dishonest business only because he is daffy about her, even though Silk never gives him a tumble, and, in fact, never says as much as 2 words to him before. He tells her that he comes from respectable old parents down on the Lower East Side who will be very sad if he is placed in the pokey, especially his mama, but Israel Ibb is bound and determined to put him away, because Israel Ibb is greatly opposed to anybody copying dough out of his jug. Simeon Slotsky says his mama cries all over Israel Ibb's vest, trying to cry him out of the idea of placing her son in the pokey, but that Israel Ibb is a very hard-hearted guy and will not give in no matter what. And furthermore, he is very indignant because Simeon's mama's tears go up his vest. So, Simeon says it looks as if he must go to the pokey unless Silk can think of something. Now, Silk is very young herself and very tender-hearted, and she is sorry for Simeon Slotsky because she can see he is nothing but a 100% chump. So she sits down and writes a letter to Israel Ibb asking him to call on her backstage at the Follies on a matter of great importance. Of course, Silk does not know that it is not the proper caper to be writing a banker such a letter, and ordinarily it is 1,000 to 1, according to the way the Greek figures the odds, that a banker will pay no attention to such a letter except maybe to notify his lawyer. But it seems that the letter tickles Israel Ibb, as he always secretly wishes to get a peek backstage at the Follies to see if the dolls back there wear as few clothes as he hears, so he shows up the very same night, and in 5 minutes Silk has him all rounded up as far as Simeon Slotsky is concerned. Israel Ibb says he will straighten out everything and send Simeon to a job in a jug out west. So the next day, Simeon Slotsky comes around and thanks Silk for all she does for him and bawls quite some and gets a photograph off her with her name signed to it, which he says he will give to his mama so she can stick it up on her wall on the east side to always remember the doll who saves her son. And then Simeon Slotsky goes on about his business and for all I know becomes a very honest and useful citizen. And 48 hours later, Silk is wearing the emerald from Israel Ibb. Now, this Israel Ibb is by no means a Broadway character, and in fact, few ever hear from him before he bobs up sending Silk an emerald ring. In fact, it seems that Israel Ibb is a quiet, industrious guy who has nothing on his mind but running his jug and making plenty of scratch until the night he goes to see Silk. He's a little short, fat guy of maybe 40-odd at this time, with a little round stomach sticking out in front of him, and he always wears a white vest on his stomach, with a pair of gold-rimmed cheaters hanging on a black ribbon across his vest. He has a large snozzle and is homely as a mud fence any way you take him, but is well known to one and all that he is a coming guy in the banking dodge. Silk is always making jokes about Israel Ibb because naturally she cannot see much to such a looking guy, but every morning she comes into Mindy's with all kinds of swag, such as bracelets and rings and brooches, and Jewelry Joe finally speaks to her very severely and tells her that a guy who can send her such merchandise is no joking matter. There is no doubt that Israel Ibb is dizzy about her, and personally I consider it very sad that a guy as smart as he must be lets himself get tangled up in such a situation. But then I remember that guys 10,000 times smarter than Israel Ibb let themselves get tangled up the same way, so it is all even. The upshot of the whole business is that Silk begins to pay a little serious attention to Israel Ibb, and the next thing anybody knows, she quits the Follies and takes to living in a large apartment on Park Avenue and riding around in a big car with a guy in uniform driving her, and she has enough fur coats for a tribe of Eskimos, including a chinchilla flogger that moves Israel back 30 Gs. Furthermore, it comes out the apartment house she is living in is in her own name, and some citizens are greatly surprised that they do not figure a doll just off Broadway smart enough to get anything in her own name, except maybe a traffic summons. But Professor D says he is not surprised because he once makes Silk read a book entitled The Importance of Property. We do not see much of Silk anymore these days, but every now and then we hear rumors of her getting more apartment houses and business buildings in her own name, and the citizens around Mindy's are greatly pleased because they figure that proves that the trouble they take educating Silk is by no means wasted. Finally, we hear Silk goes to Europe, and for nearly 2 years she is living in Paris and other spots, and some say the reason she sticks around Europe is because she finds out all of a sudden that Israel Ibb is a married guy. Although personally I figure Silk must know this all along, because it is certainly no mystery. In fact, Israel Ib is very much married indeed, and his ever-loving wife is a big fat old doll whose family has plenty of potatoes. The chances are Silk is sick and tired of looking at Israel Ib and stays abroad so she will not have to look at his ugly kisser more than 2 or 3 times a year, which is about as often as Israel Ib can think up excuses to go over and see her. Then one winter we hear Silk is coming home to stay, and it is the winter of 1930 when things are very tough indeed. It is close to Christmas when Silk lands one morning around 11 o'clock from the steamship, and it seems she is expecting Israel Ib to meet her at the dock. But Israel Ib is not present, and nobody else is there to tell her why Israel Ib is absent. It seems that some of Silk's luggage is being held up by customs guys, as she brings over enough merchandise of one kind and another to stock a department store, and she wishes to see Israel Ib to get this matter straightened out. So she hires a taxi and tells the jockey to take her to Israel Ib's jug, figuring to stop in a minute and give Israel Ib his instructions and maybe a good rousting around for not meeting her. Now, Silk never before goes to Israel Ib's jug, which is deep down on the Lower East Side, where many citizens wear long whiskers and do not speak much English, and where there always seems to be a smell of herring around and about, and she is greatly surprised and much disgusted by her surroundings as she approaches the corner where Israel Ib's jug stands. Furthermore, she is much surprised to find a big crowd in front of the jug, and this crowd is made up of many whiskers and old dolls wearing shawls over their heads, and kids of all sizes and shapes, and everybody in the crowd seems much excited, and there is plenty of moaning and groaning from one and all, and especially from an old doll who is standing in the doorway of a little store a couple of doors from the jug. In fact, this old doll is making more racket than all the rest of the crowd put together, and at times is raising her voice to a scream, and crying out in a strange language words that sound quite hostile. Silk's taxi cannot get through the mob, and a copper steps up and tells the driver he better make a detour. So Silk asks the copper why these people are raising such a rumpus in the street instead of being home keeping warm, for it is colder than a blonde's heart, and there's plenty of ice around about. "Why," the copper says, "do you not hear? This jug bust this morning, and the guy who runs it, Israel Ib, is over in the tombs, and the people are nervous because many of them have their potatoes in the jug. In fact," the copper says, "some of them, including the old doll over there in front of the store who is doing all the screeching, have their lifetime savings in this jug, and it looks as if they are ruined. It is very sad," he says, "because they are very, very poor people." And then tears come to his eyes, and he buffs an old guy with whiskers over the skull with his club because the old guy is moaning so loud the copper can scarcely make himself heard. Now, naturally, this is almost surprising news to Silk, and while she is pretty much sored up because she cannot see Israel Ib to get her merchandise out of the customs, she has the taxi jockey take her away from those scenes right away and up to her apartment in Park Avenue, which she has ready for her coming home. Then she sends out for the early editions of the evening papers and reads all about what a rapscallion Israel Ib is for letting his jug bust right in the poor people's faces. It seems that Israel Ib is placed in the tombs because somebody suspects something illegal about the busting, but of course nobody figures Israel Ib will be kept in the tombs long on account of being a banker, and in fact there's already some talk that the parties who placed him there in the first place may find themselves in plenty of heat later on, because it is considered most discourteous to a banker to place him in the tombs where the accommodations are by no means first class. One of the papers has a story about Israel Ib's ever-loving wife taking it on the lam as soon as the news gets out about the jug busting, and Israel Ib being in the tombs, and about her saying he can get out of this predicament the best way he can, but that she will never help with as much as a thin dime of her dough, and hinting pretty strong that Israel Ib's trouble is on account of him squandering the jug's scratch on a doll. The story says she is going back to her people, and from the way the story reads, it sounds as if the scribe who writes it figures this is one good break, at least for Israel Ib. Now, these hints let out by Israel Ib's ever-loving wife about him squandering the jug's scratch on a doll are printed as facts in the morning papers the next morning, and maybe if Silk bothers to read those morning sheets, she will think better of going down to Israel Ib's jug again, because her name is mentioned right out, and there are big pictures of her in the papers from her old days in the Follies. But there Silk is in a taxi in front of the Bank of Bridges at 9 o'clock the next morning, and it seems her brain is buzzing with quite a large idea, although this idea does not come out until later. There is already quite a crowd around the jug again, as it is always very difficult to make people who live on the Lower East Side and wear whiskers and shawls understand about such matters as busted jugs. They are apt to hang around a busted jug for days at a time with their bank books in their hands, and sometimes it takes as much as a week to convince such people that their potatoes are gone for good and make them disperse to their homes and start saving more. There is still much moaning and groaning, although not as much as the day before, and every now and then the old doll pops out of the little store and stands in the doorway and shakes her fist at the busted jug and hollers in a strange language. A short, greasy-looking guy with bristly whiskers and an old black derby hat jammed down over his ears is standing with a morning paper spread out in his hands, and a bunch of other guys are around him listening to him read what the paper has to say about the situation. Just one copper is walking up and down now, and is the copper who speaks to Silk the day before, and he seems to remember her. She gets out of the taxi, and he walks over to her, while a lot of people stop moaning and groaning to take a gander at her, for it is by no means a common sight to see such a looking doll in this neighborhood. The copper no more than says good morning to Silk when the guy who is reading the paper stops reading and takes a peek at her, and then at her picture, which is on the page in front of him. Then he points at the picture, and points at Silk, and begins jabbering a blue streak to the guys around him. About this time, the old doll peeps out of the store to shake her fist at Israel Ibb's jug again, and hearing the jabbering, she joins the bunch around the guy with the paper. She listens at the jabbering a while, peeking over the guy's shoulder at the picture, and then taking a good long look at Silk, and then all of a sudden the old doll turns and pops back into the store. Now all the shawls and whiskers start gathering around Silk and the copper, and anybody can tell from the way they are looking that they are all soared up, and what they are soared up at is Silk, because naturally they figure out that she is the doll whose picture is in the morning paper, and is therefore the doll who is responsible for Israel Ibb's jug busting. But, of course, the copper does not know they are soared up at Silk, and figures they are gathering around just out of curiosity, as people will do when they see a copper talking to anybody. He is a young copper, and naturally does not wish to have an audience when he is speaking to such a looking doll as Silk, even if most of the audience cannot understand English, so as the crowd nudges closer, he gets his club ready to boff a few skulls. Just about then, half a brickbat hits him under the right ear, and he begins wobbling about very loose at the hinges, and at the same minute, all the shawls and whiskers are take to pulling and hauling at Silk. There are about 100 of the shawls and whiskers to begin with, and more are coming up from every which direction, and they are all yelling and screaming and punching and scratching at Silk. She is knocked down 2 or 3 times, and many shawls and whiskers are walking up and down her person while she is on the ground, and she is bleeding here and there, and the chances are they will kill her dead as a doornail in their excitement if the old doll from the little store near the jug does not bob up all of a sudden with a mop handle in her duke and starts boffing the shawls and whiskers on their noggins. In fact, the old doll plays a regular tune on those noggins with the mop handle, sometimes knocking a shawl or whiskers quite bow-legged, and soon clearing a path through the crowd to Silk and taking hold of Silk and dragging her off into the store just as the reserves and an ambulance arrive. The young copper is still wobbling about from the brickbat and speaking of how he hears the birdies singing in the trees, although of course there are no birdies in this neighborhood at such a time of year, and no trees either, and there are maybe half a dozen shawls and whiskers sitting on the pavement rubbing their noggins, and others are diving into doorways here and there, and there is much confusion generally. So the ambulance takes Silk and some of the shawls and whiskers to a hospital, and Professor D and Doc Darrow visit her there a couple of hours later, finding her in bed somewhat plastered up in spots but in no danger, and naturally Professor D and Doc Darrow wish to know what it is she is doing around Israel Ibb's jug anyway. "Why," Silk says, "I am not able to sleep a wink all last night thinking of these poor people suffering on account of me taking Israel Ibb's dough. Although," Silk says, "of course I do not know it is wrong dough when I receive it. I do not know Israel Ibb is clipping these poor people. But seeing them around the jug yesterday morning, I remember what happens to my poor mama when the jug busts on her. I see her standing in front of the busted jug with me beside her, crying her eyes out, and my heart is very heavy," Silk says. "So I get to thinking," she says, "that it will be a very nice thing indeed if I am first to tell the poor souls who will have their dough in Israel Ibb's jug that they are going to get it back." "Wait a minute," Doc Darrow says. "What do you mean they are going to get their dough back?" "Why," Silk says, "I consulted Judge Goldstein, who is my tongue, and a very good guy at that, and fairly honest last night, and Judge Goldstein tells me that I am worth in negotiable securities and real estate and jewelry, and one thing and another, about 3,100,000 bobs and a few odd cents. Judge Goldstein tells me," Silk says, "that such a sum will more than pay off all the depositors in Israel Ibb's jug. In fact, Judge Goldstein tells me that what I have probably represents most of the deposits in the jug, and," she says, "I sign everything I own in this world over to Judge Goldstein to do this, although Judge Goldstein says there is no doubt I can beat any attempt to take my dough away from me if I wish to keep it. So," Silk says, "I am so happy to think that these poor people will get their dough back that I cannot wait for Judge Goldstein to let it out. I wish to break the news to them myself, but," Silk says, "before I can say a word, they hop on me and start giving me a pasting, and if it is not for the old doll with the mop handle, maybe you will have to chip in to bury me because I certainly do not have enough dough left to bury myself." Well, this is about all there is to the story, except that the Bank of the Bridges pays off 100% on the dollar, and what is more, Israel Ibb is running it again, and doing very well indeed, and his ever-loving wife returns to him, and everything is hotsy-totsy between them. As for Silk, she is back on Broadway, and the last time I see her, she's in love with a very legitimate guy who is in the hotel business. And while he does not strike me as having much brains, he has plenty of youth running for him. And Silk says it is the best break she ever gets in her life when Israel Ibb's jug busts. But anybody will tell you that the best break Silk ever gets is when the old doll on the Lower East Side recognizes her from the photograph she has stuck up on the wall in the little store near Israel Ibb's jug as the doll who once saved her son, Simeon Slotsky, from being placed in the pokey.